And you're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2. We are on location at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, interviewing some scholars and professors. And right now we're joined by Thomas Henriksen. America and the Rogue States is the name of his book. Dr. Henriksen, how do you define a rogue state?
Well, it's an easy definition. It's a stark definition because we usually think of rogue states as states that manufacture or try to manufacture weapons of mass destruction, meaning nuclear weapons, biological weapons, or chemical weapons. And there also happen to be dictatorships, suppressing human rights, violators of international norms. So the definition is pretty precise. I think most people understand. And when we mention rogue states, certain states come to mind easily. We think of Iran. We think of North Korea. We thought of Iraq the same way before the invasion. And there have been other states that have been sort of like rogue states close to it, such as, say, Cuba, which we no longer think much of as a rogue state, or Libya at one time, because it too was a dictatorship, manufacturing weapons of mass destruction. And there have been other states such as Myanmar, or Burma as it's sometimes called, which were on the path to roguedom, or Venezuela before Hugo Chavez died. I mean, these were states. So the path is somewhat familiar, and the definition as well.
Well, one of the things you get into in your book is how superpowers use the rogue states, or how rogue states use superpowers. How is that done?
Well, I think what's happened is when the rogue states first burst on the international scene after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they were somewhat footloose and fancy-free. They didn't really depend too much on another major state, such as the Soviet Union, because it was gone. And gradually what we've seen is that rogue states in the past were used by great powers, particularly the Soviet Union when we had the Cold War, and they used the major powers for protection. Currently, we can see that North Korea is very dependent, for example, on China. That Iran, while it's not as dependent, it still relies on Russia to run some diplomatic interference for it in the United Nations. And in the case of Iraq, it was very much dependent on Soviet arms, and so is Libya, for example. So these states have used and been used by great powers. They're used because I think it's too dangerous during the Cold War for the United States and the Soviet Union to collide in a nuclear exchange. So both states had clients, or both states had powers that they could use periodically, or alliances. The difference is the Soviet states were really bad actors. I mean, the states such as Iran, for example, or Iraq, North Korea, Syria, Libya.
Has the U.S. ever used rogue states, in your view?
No, but we had states that I think we cozied up to for fear of communism. We're not particularly, I would say, Boy Scout states, or states that we would assume are up and standing. For example, Mobutu in the Congo was a very disreputable character, suppressed human rights. Well, we backed him periodically because he was a staunch anti-communist. Or the Duvaliers in Haiti for a long time, both the Papa Doc and the so-called baby Doc Duvaliers in Haiti were staunchly anti-communist. So we tended to back them, overlook or excuse some of their human rights violations. But we've never really used these states in a confrontation or to arm them and to use them in a more aggressive manner as the Soviet Union did.
Is there an advantage for China now to have North Korea as a client state?
That's an excellent question. I think there's trade-offs. It's a becoming a more complex relationship. At one time, I would answer to say directly, yes, it is an advantage for China to have North Korea, because it kept the Americans a little bit off balance. They could be used against the United States whenever we were too friendly and provide too many arms for Taiwan, which angered the Chinese. So they would use North Korea in that sense. However, lately they are somewhat of a liability, because what's happening is it's paradoxical. Rather than being this sort of rogue state keeping the Americans off base, it's causing the United States to reinforce its armaments in in East Asia. And that's something the Chinese are not keen on. They very much resent President Obama's pivot to East Asia. They're against that. And so anything that strengthens that, reinforces it, is something the Chinese are very much against. And so consequently, the relationship is more mixed now. And so I think at times some of the Chinese officials are a little bit more wary or think that North Korea is becoming too much of a liability for them.
Thomas Henriksen, in America and the Rogue States, you talk about Iraq, the Iraq War, and one way to deal with a rogue state. Did the U.S. deal with Iraq, in your view, in the correct way?
That, again, is a very complex and a very controversial question. Many people think the war against Iraq was an unnecessary war. It was done under false premises because there were no nuclear weapons found. On balance, on the other hand, the United States rid the world of a very bad character, a man who spread terrorism, destabilized this region, did make weapons of mass destruction at one time, was found out after the Persian Gulf War in 1991, stopped for a while, but to be truthful, we also know that once the sanctions were relaxed or once world attention was off Saddam Hussein, he was going to probably return to weapons of mass destruction. The other ingredient, I think, some would argue and have argued that Saddam Hussein's removal was one of the necessary preconditions for the Arab Spring that took place years later, 10 years after the American invasion of Iraq. But on the other hand, was a necessary condition, that it showed the Arab world that a dictator could be removed, there was a new beginning could happen. So consequently, I think historians will be fighting it, just like they'll be fighting any other controversial issues, such as the origins of the Civil War or the Vietnam War, for example. Any great decision is always going to have supporters and detractors. And my own feeling is probably would have been better to avoid it, but once it was done, we can't go back. And we can't replay history to say what might have been had we not entered. So it's going to be a very difficult question for historians a long time, and it's a political question. Supporters of a former president, George W. Bush, or detractors will have varying viewpoints on the outcome and the justification for the Iraq War.
Well, this is kind of a double question. How did you feel in 2003? And in your book, you talk about the containment policy that had been the policy for many years not working very well.
The containment policy, and it had been a very vigorous containment policy. The Clinton administration called it Containment Plus. And by what they meant is we, the United States, maintained no-fly zones in North Iraq and South Iraq in order to keep Saddam Hussein under wraps. And many times those planes shot targets on the ground that were considered, for example, radar sites that had locked onto the American aircraft. There were over 200 airplanes employed in that containment. There was a feeling that we had tried a lot of things, and yet Saddam Hussein was breaking out of his containment. The sanctions weren't working. They were being violated. Even there had been a period when the United States had stopped commercial air flights going into Baghdad airport. That was being violated. Hugo Chavez, in fact, made a big issue of going to Baghdad, and he broke that airlock, for example, by his presence. And then other Arab states which had been angered by Saddam Hussein's intervention into Kuwait began to forgive him. So he was on the road to restoration, so to speak, at the time. So there was a feeling among many that he's broken out of the sanctions, that it won't be too long before the sanctions fall apart. Plus, he was very adept in keeping the sanctions, the brunt of the harm done to his own people. And there was a lot of harm done. People starved. There were a lot of desperate conditions among the poor, particularly in Baghdad and surrounding areas, caused by the sanctions. So he was very adept at it. So there was a feeling, I think, among many people that the sanctions were really breaking down. And I think the Bush administration, George W.